Hi, my name is Karen Lachelle, and I am the Executive Director of Creative Action in Austin, Texas, and a trustee of the National Guild, where I'm one of three co-chairs on the Racial Equity Committee. I have short brown hair and I'm wearing a striped black and white shirt. Sandra?
I'm Sandra Bowie, she, her. I'm an African-American woman, a co-chair, of course, of the Racial Equity Committee and a trustee of the National Guild for 5 years.
Today, we're going to quickly walk you through where we are at the National Guild right now on our journey towards becoming a fully anti-racist organization. We are certainly very much at the beginning of our work. And as you can see from this slide, the roots of our work really began within our membership and our programs, and then expanded into the focus of our board of directors more recently. Over the past 2 years, we've begun doing work to strengthen the National Guild's commitment to actualize racial equity by focusing on developing our core principles and policies, and we're now ready to engage with our members and start a next phase of action planning, which includes the full membership in our work and business planning. I'd like to acknowledge some of the many BIPOC leaders who helped this work get started in earnest at the Guild. Without their dedication and work, we would not be on this journey. The wonderful Robin Walker Murphy, James C. Horton, Ama Kojo, Laura Davis, and Rodney Camarse. This has been the work of many people, and we have acknowledged more leaders on our racial equity and community arts education webpage. We will continue to work on acknowledging all of the people who are making this work happen there. Sandra?
Thanks, Karen. As you see, in 2015, equity was in the air. Change is miraculously expansive, but change is also really hard and challenging. So we at the Racial Equity Committee will hold on to Carol Ross's words today. The Guild knows how to do change. In 2015, programming became more focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion in community arts education and was really appreciated by all. On the challenging side, the Guild became the backbone organization of a collective action initiative in 2015 that did not integrate or acknowledge equity. So the priority initiative created attention and consistent pushback and conversation on the need for more equitable processes and practices. So these discussions served as a catalyst for racial equity in the National Guild. In 2017, a task force was formed to update the mission and create values to drive the impact of the organization. Racial equity was unanimously adopted as a core value of the National Guild. And Derek Gay and other professionals began consistently doing workshops in diversity, equity, and inclusion. In 2019, we were granted a Hewlett grant and approved for $50,000 to create a racial equity strategic plan. We hired Equity Literacy Institute as our consultants to actualize equity in the National Guild, to complete the Guild Racial Equity Assessment and Racial Equity Principles. And 2020 we'll be talking about in the rest of this presentation, but I'll leave you with a quote from Ibram X. Kendi: "You cannot eliminate inequity without anti-racist policy."
Thank you, Sandra. And hello, I'm Heather Eichmeyer, she, her, hers. I'm the Chief Program Officer here at the National Guild. And if we could have the next slide. I am a white woman with blonde shoulder-length hair and a gray sweater on today. So before we begin, we wanted to just take a brief moment to look back at the roots of the organization. So we have a sense of where we've come from. The Guild's beginnings originate really at the turn of the century with the community music schools that were beginning to develop with the settlement houses. And then later, 12 of them banded together to form the Guild in the 1930s. So the original story really focused on high quality arts education. It focused on accessibility and making these programs available to all, regardless of aptitude or ability to pay. However, the settlement houses themselves were largely agencies run by white, upper class, and self-defined sort of quote unquote native-born settlers who were trying to convey the best of American culture to newly immigrated families. And the arts were a mechanism too for assimilation to the American way. So it's important to understand kind of that there were some really beautiful things with the settlement house movement, but there's also a history that's often not told there. And it isn't until the 80s and the 90s that the Guild begins to expand its membership from a small group of about 20 organizations to upwards of 300. But the membership continued to focus on community music schools and primarily centering white Eurocentric classical traditions. It's in the 2000s that the diversity of the membership begins to shift. And there begins to be an intentional effort to open up and engage a more diverse membership to address social justice and programming and to collectively advocate for and advance the field. Sandra? Sandra, I think you're still on mute.
You are absolutely right. Thank you, Heather. Thanks so much. This history helps us to understand that during much of this period, there was a field of community-based arts education about 55 or 65 years old that was diverse, multi-layered, complex, a diverse, multi-layered complex of community-based arts organizations in the US. Arts institutions that emerged from the civil rights movement, Black arts movement, LGBTQ movements, and others, but were not recognized and embraced fully by the National Guild. So the Guild's racial equity movement that we're working with now intends to really change that and bring all of this together, fully involving old, new, and evolving BIPOC community-based organizations as an integral part of our future.
Next slide. Duffy?
Yes, thank you. In 2013, Americans for the Arts published a study on arts managers across the US, finding that 86% of all respondents and 92% of CEOs self-identified as white. In 2015, Grant Makers in the Arts conducted an exploratory demographic study of arts managers, finding that 78% of respondents self-identified as white. Representation matters. 74% of students served by the Guild member organizations identify as non-white, but only 22% of arts leadership identify as non-white. The majority of decision makers in the arts sector, of which we are a part, are white. This data shows that the arts management workforce, of which community arts education is a part, does not accurately reflect US society and has further resulted in staff who may not reflect the communities they serve, nor possess the perspectives and knowledge needed in order to effectively connect with students, and model that success doesn't have to look, act, or be centered in white Eurocentric culture.
Next slide. The Guild is at the beginning stages of its own anti-racism work. As we know, many in the field, many of you are as well. According to our 2019 benchmarking data survey of the membership, most participating organizations said that they had taken some action in the past 2 years to address racial equity. Now, keep in mind, this survey was issued a year ago, so before the racial reckoning of 2020, following the murders of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and too many others, which of course prompted an outpouring of statements from the arts sector. You'll see in this slide that the most common actions that member organizations have been taking already were the recruitment of candidates of color at various positions across the institution and adopting statements. Next slide. Next slide, please. So as we know from the survey, few in our sector have gone beyond those statements to address racism at the structural or policy levels. So today, and in our presentation, we really hope this will be an invitation to take our collective work in the field to the next level. We know the appetite is there, but there is need for more understanding of the actions that can be taken. Sandra. And next slide, please.
Yes, next slide, please. Thank you. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Racial Equity Committee charge, and I'm getting a flashback. Last year, we talked to you about this charge, but you were sitting in an audience listening and came up with questions afterwards. So I missed that. And hopefully soon we will come together. But our charge is in 3 parts. The first part is to provide guidance in actualizing the Guild's core values. Racial equity is a core value of the Guild, which means it's foundational to the process. Racial equity has not been in the past foundational to the Guild's work completely. Our role is to, in the Racial Equity Committee, is to unravel inequitable policies and practices and construct anti-racist practices and structures for the Guild and for community arts education. The second part of the charge is to investigate the roots of inequity. I must say that the racial justice reckoning in the world that's happening now has demonstrated the prominence of structural and systemic racism in the institutions of our country. The Guild is meeting this challenge by creating a racial equity strategic vision and plan towards an anti-racist worldview and practice for community arts education. Our approach is to create equity within structural racism using anti-racist methodology. The beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself. And that is the only way forward, says Ojioma Oluo, and I agree wholeheartedly. And finally, 3, we're charting a course to dismantle inequity in community arts education in the National Guild and throughout the field. And that is the subject of the remainder of this presentation on principles and policies. And as Ibram X. Kendi has said, you cannot eliminate inequity without anti-racist policy. Thank you. And I think it's Karen. Thank you.
So we as community arts educators have a real responsibility to prioritize addressing racial injustice as a crucial part of our work. Structural and institutional racism and violence directly impact the people who make up our communities and our organizations. The work to address this includes acknowledging the roots of racial inequity, including within our own organization and practice, and dismantling these inequities by developing and implementing equitable structures, policies, and practices that are rooted in social justice values. Our racial equity guiding principles and policies that we're sharing with you today outline the steps we are taking moving forward. So recently, through a process working with consultants from the Equity Literacy Institute, we conducted an assessment of the National Guild, as we mentioned before. This assessment revealed the specific areas where the Guild needed to evolve, change, and dismantle white supremacy culture. The board and staff together then took that information and designed these core principles to guide our work towards actualizing racial equity. We believe that racial inequities are power and policy problems, and racial equity requires power and policy solutions. If we want to realize equity, we cannot create it within the known world, the old ways. There are established roles of advantage and disadvantage institutionalized within all of our systems. So we must create something new. So here are our policies, rather our principles. The first principle, the prioritization of those most impacted. In order to create true equity, we must center the experiences and interest of those who have been marginalized. If not, we will continue to perpetuate inequity in systems that exclude those who have been left out. Secondly, a redistribution of power. There are established, institutionalized roles of advantage and disadvantage within our collective American society and within our organization. Equity requires the redistribution of material, power, cultural, and social access. 3, direct confrontation. Equitable practice requires us to directly confront all instances of inequity. This includes manifestations in our interpersonal relations and institutional practices to better and more transparently address cultural and structural racism within the broader context of our work. Confrontation does not mean acts of hostility or aggression towards one another. It means it requires a strong resolve to stand in solidarity and address racist words and actions. Fourth, reparation and advocacy. We acknowledge that the foundations of the United States were built from acts of terror, such as the enslavement of African people whose bodies created the vast wealth of American capitalism. We follow the collective work of Movement for Black Lives and other Black-led organizations in their demands for reparations. And lastly, a transformation of self. In an ultimate service to the community arts education field, we believe in and commit to our personal transformation as individuals and as a collective. This includes the Guild trustees, the Guild staff, and all other Guild stakeholders. Now we'd like to share you how these principles really manifest as actionable policies that we've also adopted at the Guild and will really be guiding the next phase of work that we are doing. Next slide. And I think Lisette.
Yes, thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. This is Lisette Martinez, the Network and Learning Coordinator here at the Guild. I have light skin, a pear-shaped face, thick, dark eyebrows, and dark brown round eyes. I also have blunt bangs, long hair with dark roots and forest green ends. And I'm wearing a black t-shirt. So thank you all again for being here and for supporting us and supporting your communities. For these next few slides, for the sake of time, we're just going to highlight one policy for each principle. They will be presented on the slide as floating text with the principle in the center of the slide and with the policy surrounding the principle. You've received a slideshow with all of these principles and policies, so you can review them there as well. So now I'm just going to share what we've committed to. Our first principle here up on the slide is prioritization of those most impacted. And so one of the policies that I'm highlighting today is that we're going to build intentional relationships with Black, Indigenous, and people of color leaders and those organizations that are accountable to Black, Indigenous, people of color communities to affect positive social change. I'll now pass it to Karen for the next slide.
Thanks, Lisette. The second principle, redistribution of power, the way that that would really manifest as a policy, as an example, would be the way that we will commit to supporting, recognizing, and prioritizing the leadership of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color throughout the entire National Guild organization. Next slide.
This is Lisette again. For our third principle, direct confrontation, we will, along with stakeholders from every area of our organization, routinely review, assess, and align the Guild with our mission, vision, and values with a focus on racial equity. We will also be transparent regarding these any internal challenges. So next slide, Karen.
Thanks, Lisette. Reparation and advocacy. We will advocate for equitable funding for arts organizations operated by and for African Americans. We will seek and provide resources for these organizations and make membership fully accessible for those who wish to join. Next slide.
Lisette here again. For our fifth principle, transformation of self, as a historically white-led and white-serving organization, we recognize that in order to transform, we should be learners and creators of cultural and racial equity. And as both learners and creators, this journey of creating these principles and sharing them with you and committing to them is just one example how we are now living out this policy and this principle. And so I'll now pass it to Derek, who will be responding to some of the questions that we've received in advance from the field.
Thanks, Lisette. This is Derek Gay, Guild trustee. I am Black, dark caramel, brown, and bald. We received a number of questions and we will have a subsequent opportunity to engage more fully, but I wanted to address three of the questions. One was around appreciation of this work and also wondering how does this manifest in thinking about art or arts education? It's a great question. And so the idea is that these principles provide a framework not only for thinking of the organization, but also thinking about every other part of the system. So thinking about arts education, thinking about within the various disciplines of dance and ceramics and music and the like. So it's not that the idea is the framework is able to address all of the various discrete components, but we can use the framework to then apply to every part of arts education. And there's certainly frameworks that we can provide for you for more discrete information around that. There's
Derek, could
Yes?
you turn your camera on for us so we can see you?
Yeah,
Awesome, thanks.
there we go. The second question was around, there were two related questions around offering advice on how to get this work started. And then how do you deal with resistance? So a couple of things is one, certainly you should expect whenever you're engaging in change management that you're going to receive feedback, and that feedback often takes the form of what we call resistance. If you don't receive resistance, that means people don't care. So I see resistance as a natural part of change management, and individuals are processing. If you don't see resistance, that means that people are sharing, but they don't feel comfortable sharing in a way that gets to you. So I would integrate that resistance into part of the work that you're doing. Begin with starting with the mission of the organization and embedding this work into the mission, as we've done at the Guild, looking at our mission and our values. Also, it's important to provide multiple entry points for people to enter the conversation. Not everyone has the same level of content knowledge. Not everyone has the same level of awareness around these issues. So to move forward at this, the speed of a bullet, without taking the time to really create a space for folks to enter as they are, and then bringing them all together around these goals would be super important. And to provide education for all constituent groups. We've certainly seen people speak about racial equity and anti-racism and have very different understandings of what that means. So providing common language and models and framework will be critical. I also think about the work specifically around racial equity. There's a wonderful article in Harvard Business Review that we'll be able to share with you that looks at an acronym. PRESS is the acronym, and I think it's very sort of concise at thinking about the journey. It's called PRESS is the acronym, and the P stands for problem awareness. So you can't engage in work around anti-racism if people are unaware or still debating of the validity that racism exists, not only in our society, which is where many people will agree, but that racism also exists in our organizations. And sometimes that takes time for people to reconcile those two, because they feel as if the acknowledgement of racism is an indictment on who we are, an indictment of our traditions, and it forces people to look in the mirror. And it's difficult often for people to reconcile, yes, we are a thoughtful organization, and at the same time, we're holding racist policies, practices, and traditions. How do you reconcile those two? As Sandra mentioned, this whole idea of being an anti-racist doesn't mean that you are perfect. It doesn't mean that you are without racism. It's beginning that process of identifying and dismantling racism. The R in PRESS speaks to the root cause analysis. So really getting to the core root of some of these issues and not looking at symptoms. So often the symptom is we don't have lots of BIPOC leaders in our arts organizations. And so perhaps we'll start a one-year program where we bring BIPOC folks together, but not looking at the entire system, not looking at how we're sourcing individuals. There isn't a pipeline problem. Not looking at our interview process, and not looking at some of the embedded structures that would create disproportionality in our leadership. So really get to the root cause. The E in PRESS is empathy. And it's something that we often don't mention in this space. Empathy is understanding and caring about the feelings of others. And often we don't have empathy. We come in from an intellectual perspective, but do you really care enough to engage in the work? And do you really care enough about the harm that is being done to those who are impacted by racism? The S in PRESS is strategy. So there needs to be a defined set of tactics and to address these issues. It can't be a one-off, and it can't be a one-year theme of anti-racism. And the last impress is sacrifice, that it will require some sacrifice. It will require perhaps not doing things the way that we have always done, which initially may require more time, which initially may require more capital, just different ways of doing things that may not be the path of least resistance. But everyone in the organization needs to be convinced and believe that this work of anti-racism is part of the mission of our organizations and certainly part of the mission of ARTS. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, whoever's next.
Thanks, Derek.
That's Heather.
And Adam, if we could have the last slide, please. So we recognize that we had 30 minutes to share all of this information with you today. Hopefully you all had a chance to review it in advance. It also lives on our website. So we encourage you to read more about the principles and policies and the timeline of this work on our website as well. But we're really interested in continuing the conversation with you. We'd like to know how you'd like to continue the conversation and this work with us. Where do you need support, and what questions do you have? So we're going to just take 2 minutes right now and invite you all in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen to type in your feedback, your comments, your questions around how you'd like to continue the conversation. Where do you need support, and what questions do you have? So we'll pause for about 2 minutes and invite you to share with us in the Q&A box. And as folks continue to write their questions, I will now turn things over to Duffy to close us out today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you again, our Racial Equity Committee, Derek, Karen, Sandra, Lisette, Heather, and the whole committee. That was for that very important conversation and presentation. And I want to thank all of you once again for joining us today. Let me again thank and congratulate our amazing awardees, Carol Ross and Rhiannon Giddens, and thank them for inspiring us all with their poignant remarks and their continued powerful work in community arts education. And thanks again to each of you, our members, for your partnership with the Guild and for all of the extraordinary ways in which you enrich your communities each and every day through your work. We continue to stand in admiration. Finally, let me acknowledge that most of us are feeling very stretched, particularly this year. But I probably would not be doing my job as board chair if I didn't ask you, if you are able, to consider supporting us with a gift to the Guild to help us continue our vital work and growth. We would certainly be extremely grateful and honored to have your support. Please stay safe and stay well. Let us know how we can be the best resource possible to you. We look forward to an ongoing collaboration and to our work together. Thank you so much, everyone.